Hey everyone, it's Joe from Humanfluence, and I've got to give you a little heads up before we dive in. The F-bomb will be dropped today. Don't worry though, it's all in the name of seeking the truth. And do I have a guest for you? Today I'm speaking with Liz Entin, author of 2 compelling books that chronicle her exploration into the afterlife from a skeptic's point of view. Her journey began with What the Fuck Just Happened. A sciencey skeptic explores grief, healing, and evidence of an afterlife, where she shares how losing her father sparked a search for evidence beyond what she'd previously thought possible. In her sequel, she dives even deeper, testing psychic techniques, exploring CIA-inspired methods, and navigating the surreal moments that came along the way. I'd like to welcome Liz to the show. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Joe. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely, thank you. Well, I want to dive right in and talk about your journey. Losing your father sparked this whole journey into the afterlife. And did you expect it would change you so much? And what surprised you the most?
Oh my God. I did not even close to expect it would change me. I didn't even really expect I'd find such valid evidence. I think that's what surprised me the most. I mean, every day it's like constant surprises. I can't believe I wrote these books. I just guess I still sometimes am shocked that there's evidence that afterlife seems to most likely be real. It pretty much kind of blows my mind. It's just not how I ever thought the world was.
I love that. Speaking of grief, you've been very open about your grief, and I'm very sorry for your loss. And people that come to your channel for grief will find a lot of help in that way. So you share about it publicly, though, and this must have been difficult, not as well as writing about it. So how did all of this help you process the loss of your father?
Yeah, I wasn't even at all in the beginning planning to talk about this publicly. I'm actually a pretty private person. I was investigating this evidence, and I was just writing it for myself, like blogging it privately. And I mean, I think I ended up putting some of the blogs kind of public, but did nothing so anyone would find it. So it had no readers, and I was, everything was really disguised, and just it kind of grew. Like the further I went with it, the more and more I just wanted to share further. I would tell people very secretly that I was doing this and assume they were going to think I was really weird about investigating afterlife evidence or going to mediums. Everyone was fascinated. It was a very different response than I was expecting. They wanted to know more. They were like, oh, that's not weird at all. That's interesting. Like especially the kind of people who would have thought I was weird. So, I mean, not 100% of people, but I'd say almost everybody. And they'd want to sit and talk about it for a really long time. And no matter what else we were there to talk about, this was what they'd end up wanting to talk about. And every time I wrote about it just for myself in a more like journalistic approach, I'd feel better. And I would just, very little was helping me feel better. And that was one of the only things. And I would laugh because there was something really funny about the idea of me that, I just never believed any of this stuff. So suddenly there I was with at events for mediums. And I really sort of the official kick in the ass to go forward with it was twofold. I started a podcast during COVID, just, one of those COVID hobbies. And I decided to, finally really edit it and publish it and then publish my book. I'd had an editor. I'd been really delayed with it. Sadly, there was another loss. My main mentor in this world got cancer over quarantine and passed away. And I kind of went through one of the mediums who hadn't even really known the extent I was going forward with the book. Got a message from her that basically let me know I needed to move forward and publish it. And if you knew my mentor, Fran, you do not say no to her. She is a tough lady. And I was like, yeah, it was just kind of the final kick in the ass to publish it.
Well, it seems like there's been some having to follow signs and trust your gut, and just part of the healing process is navigating all these different questions and how you deal with it is personal, yet you're public with it. And I want to I want to ask you this, like, what is something about grief that you only understand when you're in it?
Oof. In a weird way, I almost kind of think everything. I think it's just ununderstandable until you experience it. One thing that was I hadn't really understood was it's so physical. Like I always, of course, knew before experiencing it, and I'd experienced lighter versions before, is that you'd feel sad, but it's just like, for me, it was this physical overtaking of my body. Like I could barely move, I could barely stand up. Everything felt so heavy. Another is just, and I thought I was alone with this, but it turns out it's universal. People that you always thought you would count on for things end up being people you absolutely cannot count on. They say the dumbest things. They're completely very, very correcty of grief. I hadn't realized how much kind of lack of sympathy or empathy there is surrounding grief. In the sense they'll say, oh, sorry for your loss, but they don't really want you to feel bad. They don't really want to respect your feelings. And then on the positive aspect of that, new people come in that just end up being like your lifesavers that you never would have thought you would have met. So
I love that.
Kind of twofold.
People's true colors shine, for sure.
Yes. Yes.
Let's get into your books, and thank you for sharing all that personal stuff. In your books, you balance skepticism with curiosity. I want to know, when you were in the deep of your grief and healing, how did you not get swept away by your emotions? And were there times you had to refocus on finding evidence rather than getting caught up?
And caught up in what sense? Sorry, you froze there for a second, so I think I missed part of your question. So apologies if I'm asking something you said. It swept up in the sense of being like so grief-stricken that I couldn't do anything, or swept up in like overly believing all of this and not keeping a logic?
Yes, because I know there could be times when you have enough compelling evidence. It seems like you have the answer, but then there's still that doubt that creeps in, that skepticism that always comes back. So, especially I can imagine when you're in the deep of trying to heal and deal with grief, this evidential stuff you're finding must be so compelling, and it must be more emotional than just finding it not from a state of grief. Or is that not true?
Oh my God. It was completely emotional. I think what kept me sort of logical through all of it is it also just seemed impossible. It makes no sense when you stop to really think about it, that consciousness is not created by a brain, and that, like, how could your personality continue? And that's just the whole human experience. So I think the absolute extraordinariness of it, it seemed absolutely unbelievable. And you know what? Ironically, it still does. But at the same time, when I start to hear about, like David Chalmers' comments on the hard problem of consciousness, that it also which basically is, it makes no sense either. Like, we don't understand consciousness. And it's just as weird to think the mass and matter of our brain neurons create this complex consciousness with love and emotions and complexity. So it really was, but at the time it made a lot more sense to me that consciousness was created by a brain, even though both are very weird. So I had never thought any of the stuff I was discovering or seeing, or mediums getting accurate information, or any of it was even remotely possible. So I think the fact that I thought there was basically 0% chance, and while there's incredibly strong evidence, it's not like actual proof, I mean, it's not like someone would tell you, I don't know, like something that isn't, that we don't know, that wouldn't make sense to us anymore with our level of knowledge, but like, oh, there's no other planets, let's say, then, now we have telescopes and you go out there and you go further, or, there's proof you get that changes world views as we grow as humans. Like, there was a time people, I think, thought that only their little island where they lived was the only place in the world, and the water at the coasts were the end of the world. And now, there's direct proof now as travel grew. So it's not like any of this has such concrete proof. But as more and more happens, you just can't explain it by normal means. So
Absolutely. What has been the hardest concept for you to wrap your mind around? I know continuity of consciousness is one big thing, but you've had so many guests on your channel and spoken about so many different things that I'm sure there's something where you're like, I can't understand that.
Yeah, I mean, well, I will just say, I mean, because all of it, whether it's remote viewing or psychic abilities, it all shows that our consciousness is stored somewhere and interacts in some way that more downloads by the brain. That I still just find that just amazing, because that's what all of this really points to. Every guest, no matter what. I think the one thing that I have not seen, even though there are people I trust who say it exists, is the level of physical mediumship that some people make claims to have seen. And, because of my respect for these people and what I've heard about some of these physical mediums, I believe them, but part of me also doesn't. I'm like, that's just something I have to see. I can't wrap my mind around it. And I have seen fraudulent physical mediumship, and I've seen possible aspects of genuine, but it's very mild hints, like maybe a dice will roll to a certain number significantly beyond the odds of chance, or spoon bending. But actual physical mediumship, to the extent I've heard, where like physical bodies are manifested, they're probably not solid. It's probably a little bit like see-through, the way stereotypical ghosts are portrayed in films. But, I mean, I hear of that. I hear of actually like one physical medium whose scientists claim is genuine and researchers claim is genuine. I mean, the scientists studying this, traditional scientists, are still not believing any of this, but, a physical hand that they can touch manifests. And it's my dream to get to go see a physical mediumship of that quality in action. So
Yes, that would be amazing, wouldn't it?
yeah.
You've done some pretty unconventional things. You mentioned spoon bending. I want to talk about you yourself took a psychic development class as well as attending a seance. So can we talk about all that?
Yeah. So I've taken quite a few psychic development classes at this point. And, my whole approach, I don't really consider myself someone that has abilities. I took it more, it's like, I would say a very journalistic approach. I wanted to explore all of this. I wanted to see what was going on. And it was fascinating. I mean, there was a time I actually got information myself. And that's happened now to me 2, possibly 3 times in classes. I would never call myself a medium because I can't do this normally. I don't have this, what mediums will talk about, often trying to shut off their abilities. Information doesn't just come to me. It was a struggle, and it was when I was around a lot of other people over a consistent period of time who were doing this. And I also learned a bit about cold reading during this. I had taken a class virtually on cold reading, and so I learned the concept on it, or psychic abilities in general, and the professor, this was through the Rhine Education Center, and it was taught by Lloyd Arbach, and he talks about cold reading so you can be aware of how to avoid it and know how to spot fake. And he also believes that there's real, or I don't like the word believe, he has explored this long enough that he's assessed there is real too. So he doesn't teach cold reading in either a way to say it's all cold reading, and he doesn't teach it to have people defraud. And I also think cold reading can be a really good thing if it's done for entertainment, as long as it's clear it's entertainment. And I mean, that's what you see for stage magicians, as well as, stage mentalists, as well as a lot of other tricks. It's what you see at a party. It can be really fun, as long as it's not used to deceive. So in the classes, it was fascinating. I guess I'll talk about the most intense one I had was through my friend Renee Buck. She taught a class, and I'd gotten one other time psychic mediumship information myself at an event it was just crazy. And the last day of her class, I mean, as I said, I don't consider myself as having abilities. I was the only one taking that class that said, do not consider myself someone who has abilities. And it was so weird. It was like I felt all these energies and waves moving through me, and I just kind of knew things. Like I would feel it physiologically. Like she taught us that like a level above someone is be a parent, 2 levels above a grandparent. I think like the left side was the mother's side, right side, father's side. I might be mixing up exactly the ones she taught us, but that's how mediums would kind of go to that area to get information. And I'd move my hands there and feel like stronger waves, like a level equal to the person. Did you lose a brother? It was just so weird. And I felt like weird and wavy for about 3 days afterwards. It was absolutely remarkable. And that was the second time something like that happened to me. The first was just at an event at Forever Family Foundation, which is a group that holds a lot of grief retreats and helps people with grief, and also uses science-based testing to certify psychic mediums. And just having those few experiences absolutely changed my life. And because I couldn't deny it. I mean, it happened to me. And so when mediums would give readings, I had an understanding that before I didn't. And then, sorry, you wanted me to talk about the seance too, or do you have questions about the mediums first? Or
That was interesting. I love how you described, being open but skeptical to all of this, and you were able to do it somewhat, and how you felt different things, and that's all part of it. So that's very interesting. Yeah, I want to hear, were you able to bend a spoon, and tell us about the seance?
yeah, so spoon bending, that was fascinating because I had 2 experiences with that. The very first time I went to a workshop held by another medium who's also part of Forever Family, and this one's really well known, Laura Lynn Jackson. And I went to one of her workshops, and this was before I knew her at all. So, and this was very early. The other workshop I talked about, which was like, I think like an 8-week class, was with Renee Buck, and I already knew her by that point. I was a lot further along in my research, so I was I don't want to say less skeptical, because I always bring skepticism, but I had seen a lot more that made me think a lot more was possible. When I went to Laura's classes early on, it was the very first ventures into like psychic mediumship exploration. Like I was just starting, so I didn't really believe any of this, and my heart was so in my throat. I mean, this isn't unemotional. And I'd heard about spoon bending, and I always thought it was a stage magic trick. And I then suddenly in one of my classes, also at the Rhine with Lloyd Arbach, he's talking about it as something he's seen as genuine phenomena. I was like, there's no way. No way. So I went into Laura's workshop, and suddenly she mentions they're going to be doing spoon bending. And I was kind of shocked, because I just the day before had been thinking about it after Lloyd's class when he had talked about it, and was thinking, wow, I mean, that just sounds so tangible and undeniable if it were to happen. I don't believe it's real, but if I was to do this, this would really add to the evidence. So suddenly she's bringing out spoons. And, I will also add, I was with a friend of mine. He's a guy, he's a lot physically stronger than me. And we were handed the spoons and then told to like try to bend them normally. Neither of us could bend them. And then she had us like raise the energy of the room, was like, I think like playing music, having us like move around a little. And then, part of the theory is like you just get a little silly and it raises the energy, which somehow makes you able to bend a spoon. And she had us yell at it, bend. And then it was so weird. I felt my hands get like super, super hot. And I pressed on the spoon, which I hadn't been able to bend before with my strength, and it just like bent very easily over, as if it was like clay or something. And then I felt it get cool, and then I couldn't bend it anymore. And I also had noticed right before that other people bending spoons, and like balling them up, which I was just shocked by. And I looked over, and as I mentioned, I was with a friend of mine who's physically a lot stronger, and he couldn't bend his. So I was like, this is not strength. There's something there. And at this point, I know Laura. I trust her. She's not giving fake spoons, and, which I got more evidence of later that it's just not fake when I went to another workshop through the Forever Family Foundation on spoon bending, and it was hosted by Lloyd Arbach. And some of the Forever Family mediums were in the workshop with me, the spoon bending one, such as Janet Mayer. She's also with Forever Family. And there were a couple other mediums. And then there were some not certified Forever Family mediums that were part of the group. And I was the only one, along with this man, Peter, who was not a psychic medium in this spoon bending group. There was maybe like 7 of us. And it was all women, aside from Peter, about the same size. None of us are like bench pressing weights. The only difference is they're psychic mediums and I'm not. And so we took, Lloyd took us through the same thing, like raise the energy, be a little silly, move around, and then try to bend them. And he had like a table full, like bags of spoons and forks that were dumped open. And I kept trying to bend them. And at this point, I couldn't. I don't know why I could that one time in Laura's. Maybe just the energy of how I felt, of how new all of it was, just gave me a level of energy that I didn't have at the time. I was more used to it, but I couldn't bend the spoons and forks. And then I would hand them over to the mediums and they were all able to bend them immediately. So that definitely shows that they're not using trick spoons and forks. Plus I know Lloyd really well now. I know Laura really well. Like they would just never cheat. And so it happened. And then witnessing that other time was absolutely remarkable. And it's actually a study Lloyd has written about in a book where they send spoons bent, like for mediumship, they're spoon bending, to a metallurgist. And then they have a weightlifter bend a spoon and using strength. And they send those to a metallurgist. And there's a difference in the grain boundaries of the way it's bent. In the bent by mediums, the grain boundaries look bent over and stretched. When it's bent by a metallurgist, when it's bent by a weightlifter, the grain boundaries are broken, which, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, I've heard of that, and that is so strange. It makes you wonder, like, where that energy comes from, how you're manipulating the spoon and physical existence, but it moves different than somebody bending it with strength. It's so interesting.
It's so weird. So weird.
Yeah. And how about your seance?
Oof. Well, the seance I went to, it was fraud. It was complete fraud, which was partially disappointing and partially kind of what I expected. I was more shocked that I was finding genuine phenomena than I was finding fraud, but it was definitely disappointing. So it was at Lilydale, and I am not saying all Lilydale people are frauds by any means, but I think Lilydale can be a mixed bag, but also mediums I highly respect have been a part of it. But it was off-site of Lilydale. I know that once they explained that it was not officially part of them, that some of the seances are held off-site. So, and it was, I won't give his name because I don't name and shame, even if someone's faking, like that's just one of my policies. But, I want to share what happened so people can assess for themselves, because there is a lot of fraud and people should be able to, figure it out for themselves and get the tools to figure it out for themselves. Mm-hmm. And, so, or I hate to use the word should be able to figure it for themselves. I didn't mean it that way. I mean, I am trying to give people the information to help them be able to figure it out for themselves. I try not to use words like should. After being in grief, people hear those words all the time. Like, you should do this, you need to do this. So I try to be careful, not use those words. Grievers will relate to what I just said, unfortunately. But I went out. It was complete fraud. I went 2 nights, and it just instantly was clear it was fraud. It was like, it was just so over dramatized. That was part of it. It's kind of silly. It was at pitch black, which I heard there's reasons that sometimes seances have to be in pitch black, but this one was clearly in pitch black because it was stage magic. Like, he was like in a cabinet, which is a curtained tent and it's referred to as a cabinet in seances. And he'd come out behind it and like roaring, stomping, making noises. It was just, we'd see like lights moving, but it was clearly magic tricks with light sticks. He'd have messages for people from guides he was quote unquote channeling. And it was, but they weren't messages of like information that he had, like it wasn't like he suddenly was getting evidential information on anyone. It was just really, really clearly stage magic. And on the second night, everyone always talks about at seances, they want nothing more than to be able to see ectoplasm. And he built us up the first night that he's going to try to manifest ectoplasm. He'll do his best. Second night, after a huge lead up, speaking all the spirit voices about how they're trying to get ectoplasm, he suddenly has ectoplasm. And he called me up for some reason to have like a closer look at it. And even from far away, you could tell it was like a Santa beard. It was like a pile of cotton. It was so absurd. And sadly, I think a lot of people really believed it. And then at the end of the seance, I kind of snuck in the back area and I found like a suitcase with all the props.
Wow.
So, yeah.
That's unfortunate. I'm sorry to hear that went that way. You spent money, traveled, and it's all a sham. It just goes to show you, in every line of work, there's this good and evil aspect, this duality. But something can be set for a good intention, and somebody twists it and takes advantage of people and makes it all look bad, which is just unfortunate.
Yeah.
In your second book, you go more into like science versus spiritual. So I want to move into like how these two worlds collide for you.
Yeah, I mean, well, it was originally science that even opened my mind to this. Like the very first thoughts I had were, is it possible to turn back time in some way? Like when my dad was in hospice, kind of in the depths of grief. And I found out theoretically it is. I mean, it's not practical, but time is a lot more manipulatable, not manipulative, manipulatable than we realize. I don't know how familiar your audience is with like Einstein's theory of time relativity, the twin theory experiment, where like one twin will travel at close to the speed of light and like, let's say 2 years have passed for them, and the twin who remains on Earth, like 15 years will have passed for them. It's just, as soon as I saw that, quantum entanglement, which I know you talk about on your channel, two particles that are quantum entangled and you spread them apart and they seem to communicate, you change the spin of one, the other changes. So they seem to be communicating faster than the speed of light by a mechanism we don't understand. So it was originally science that I was like, well, what else is there? And I pretty much continue that approach in my next book. I just take a scientific approach to all of this. And, I guess like you use the word spiritual. If this is true, I guess I don't even think it's spiritual. It's science. It's literally how this works. It's our consciousness existing in some type of, for the at most we can understand now, like quantum type particle that's not physical, or not physical in a way we understand as physical with how big we are compared to quantum, or it's in another dimension we don't perceive, and then it quantum entangles here with our brains. That's how I would most likely guess at this point is how it works. But that's science. I mean, science explains. It's a methodology that explains how things work. And so to me, I don't even really think of this as spiritual. It's science because it's examining how the world works. And so I guess I continued to meet some of the scientists, such as I finally got to meet. The first book I mainly get to read about them, and I got to meet some in the second book, like Dr. Julie Beischel. She is one of the founders, along with Mark Bacuzzi, of the Windbridge Institute, and they conduct up to quintuple blinded studies on psychic mediums. So she was kind of one of the first ones I found, way before I had any medium readings, way before I started volunteering for the Forever Family Foundation. So it was kind of very, pardon me, very exciting to meet her.
I love that. When you say yes, it's really just science. We're getting closer to that, you know. Like I
Yes.
spoke about yesterday, ancient cultures' beliefs are showing up in quantum entanglement and all these different theories and actual findings in physics now. So what was considered spiritual before is becoming reality. But it's the phrasing and the way we look at it and the language around it that is going to change too. So I like that. It's a very important distinction to me because, yes, they are merging.
Yeah, yeah.
Have you found that most scientists and mediums have some common ground on this stuff? Or at least the ones you've spoken to?
Yes and no. I don't want to say most because a lot of if you talk to the average scientist, from what I understand, at least publicly, it's known that they don't believe this stuff, that they think nothing is to it. But if you speak to them privately, apparently, and I've heard this secondhand, I haven't had access to these scientists, the, bigger ones, mainstream, I mean, I hate using the word mainstream, but the ones that are not studying this, a large majority are a lot more open to this, and say we know a lot less than about this, but public they don't claim to know as much as I think publicly is said to be known about consciousness, where they'll say, oh, there's no way this is possible, but apparently when you talk to them privately, they're like a lot more like, there's so much weird stuff, this could totally be possible, and they share some really weird things they've been through. I wish I could say that I knew that firsthand, but I've heard it from people I trust who've spoken to them. The scientists that are really researching this, they're on the same page with the mediums. They haven't necessarily had it experientially, but they're agreeing that the phenomena the mediums are doing is, they're getting accurate information. They're not cheating. There isn't some explanation that's quote unquote normal where, it's just either cold reading and they think they're getting genuine information, but it's really vague, or it's cheating, or they know something's going on. Some will say they don't think it's survival. They think it's something we don't understand yet. Some will say it seems to be survival. Some don't draw conclusions, but, especially, some of the scientists, suddenly they're called like not mainstream because they start studying this. There's some of them like Sir Roger Penrose and Dr. Stuart Hameroff are working with they're not working with mediums, but they used to work with Stephen Hawking, and they study how aspects of the brain could have, quantum entangle with non-physical consciousness. They have a theory of microtubules that recently was written about in neuroscience.com, I believe, or Neuroscience magazine. I forget which magazine, but a very not open to this stuff magazine. And they weren't talking about the second level of it, which would explain how like our non-physical consciousness could interact with the brain, and consciousness could be downloaded by a brain rather than created. But they wrote about the theory of microtubules and how that seems to be why anesthesia works, and that they're backing up the first part of Penrose and Hameroff's, what's called, I think, the Orch theory, ORCH. And I mean, that's kind of amazing. And there's some big scientists there was one who did attend I've heard this again secondhand, but a really big one, attended a seance or ghost hunting with someone who is a ghost hunter who is an honest person. He said he understands based on how his understanding of energy is that this could be possible, but he'll never say it publicly because he would lose funding and respect. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot more that are on board with this. And very interestingly, very early on, I mentioned going to that medium Laura Lynn Jackson's workshop. And, you know, mediums talk a lot about signs, you know, like birds can be your loved one. And I didn't believe any of that early on. That just sounded like such nonsense. So I asked her a little bit about it. I was like, what, you're saying like my person? Did not tell her at all who I lost. You know, I was very careful about that, keeping everything evidential with mediums. But I was like, you know, so they become a bird? That makes no sense. And she was like, well, no. It's, let's say your consciousness is non-physical. They're able to manipulate, like, what is it? Like, am I pronouncing this right? The Avarian fields that birds and butterflies use for navigation, and they're able to help direct them. So they would go over to you. And I was like, well, that's like a much more logical explanation of this than I believed. And I had a physicist, like, years later on my podcast. You know, I probably said that to Laura in, like, 2016. And, like, 5 months ago or 4 months ago or so, I interviewed a physicist. The episode isn't live yet. Her name's Dr. Tiffany Todd. It will be soon. And she gave an identical explanation for how signs could work, that with birds and butterflies, through her understanding of physics. So they're saying the same things.
Yeah, it's energy. Everything's energy. So if they're manipulating energy to affect something, that's the way they would do it.
Yeah.
What other experiences have made you feel connected to something greater?
Oof. God, let's see. Well, I mean, I mentioned the times I got mediumship information, getting signs from my dad. And interestingly, the more I study this, I just feel a little bit more like we're constantly connected to the other side or other dimensions, or, you know, is it necessarily greater than us? I don't know if it's greater. It's just other dimensions and types of continuation of consciousness and others that are supporting us. And maybe some are greater in the sense they're wiser, like the way our mentors often are. You know, I can mention some of the signs. I would feel like really weird. Like, I got this sign in my book I call green feathers, and it was pretty similar to that, but I always disguise things a little so I can continue to get evidential mediumship readings. And it was kind of a big lead up to my getting it, but green was my dad's favorite color. And shortly before I got this sign, I kept thinking, like, green feather in my head, and it was tied into a reading I'd had with a medium who had mentioned that once I had seen a green feather, and I was considering that as a sign from him. And I kept thinking in my head, like, kind of like when a song gets stuck in a loop on your head, green feather. And remembering when this medium, Gina Simone, who's also a wonderful medium, had gotten that. And I'd been feeling bad because I was leaving a Forever Family event, and she left early, and I didn't get, like, the proper social media reel and videos of her. And I kept thinking, I feel so bad. I miss Gina. That was so amazing when she got the green feather. And I couldn't get that out of my head. And I stayed home with my mom that night when I got home from the retreat. And the next day, I was taking the subway back to my apartment. And I kept thinking in a loop, that was so amazing. Gina got the green feather. I feel so bad I missed getting the video of her. But, like, the closer the subway was getting to my apartment, it was narrowing down, where I kept hearing, that was amazing, she got the green feather. That was amazing, she got the green feather. As I'm walking up my stairs to my apartment, it was like green feather in my head. Not someone saying it in my ear, but exactly like when you have a song just stuck in your head and you cannot get it out, and it's like dominating your brain, and it's just annoying. And I sit on my bed, I'm like getting on my laptop to do some work, and all I'm thinking is green feather, green feather. And I looked over, and there were a pile of green feathers sitting in my room. There's like no normal way they could have gotten there. That was pretty intense. So.
Would you say that is your biggest what the fuck moment?
No, it's up there. I think studying this, there are constant what the fucks, but that's one of them. The 2 times I got mediumship information, the one time at the Forever Family Foundation retreat, and then in Renee Buck's class that I had talked about, and then there was a 3rd time I took a class with another medium, Colin Bates, and I did get information like one time there. I'd say those are the biggest what the fucks, as well as like especially early on, like my first medium reading that I got when I expected nothing. It was just like, just the shock was such a what the fuck? How is she doing this? And I would say there's constant little what the fucks along the way when you study and research this. Some bigger than others, but they're pretty constantly around.
After exploring consciousness beyond death, how has it reshaped your life's purpose?
Whew, completely different. I mean, first of all, for one of my businesses, I have, what the fuck just happened, and I like to talk about this. It's a combination of talking about this afterlife evidence and grief, because, in grief you really learn how bad not only some of the people you're close with, but society overall is terrible with grief, at least in our culture. And I don't really know why, because 100% of us will experience death, either the loss of a loved one, and if you don't experience the loss of a loved one, that means that you pass away pretty early yourself. So 100% of us are affected by it, and yet our society is so uncomfortable. And that's another important thing that I value about getting out and making people more comfortable talking about it and more supportive. And so that's become part of my mission, as well as just, I feel like through all this, I understand myself a lot better, and I feel like I'm getting a lot more aware of the type of people I want to be around when something feels right versus when it doesn't. I think a lot of us have our intuitions turned off in our childhood to survive, depending on what was expected of you in your childhood. And I feel like I'd had to turn off all my intuitions to survive. Like, I was sent to schools that were really bad for me when I was a kid, and I feel like I had to turn off every part of myself to survive in them. And so I think I was already working on kind of healing that a little bit when my dad passed, but I don't think I realized the extent to, not only were those schools traumatic, but how much I'd had to turn off everything to do with myself. And so it's kind of sped up my relearning that.
The struggles we all face to build character and help us develop, and it's not always pretty.
No, it's not.
Do you feel like those things happened to you or for you? Like, do you feel like it was all part of a bigger plan? I don't want to say destiny, but I feel like we all come into this life and we have a template, and we're going to be good at some things and bad at others. So how do you feel like all of this is meshed together to create Liz? And is it part of a bigger plan, or how do you feel?
I'm not sure. You asked if it happened to me or for me. I think that's a choice, and I've decided, I'm realizing more and more how much I have to make it happen for me. There are definitely parts where it happened to me, especially with the schools. But it's my choice, and it's a lot of work to turn it around and make it happen for me. Was it part of a big plan? I don't know. There seems to be a lot of evidence that this stuff is part of a plan, but I'm not convinced. I think there's an aspect of that. I don't know to what extent this was part of a big plan, and my whole, you know, purpose here is to realize that to the point where I make it happen for me instead of to me? Or is that just completely my choice to do that? I don't know. I would think it's a combination of both, maybe, you know. And would I choose to have, like, been sent to those schools if I could do it over? I would choose not to have been. But who knows? Like, it's actually, I mean, it's not really worth going into here, but it's another topic I'm starting to speak out about and writing a book about, and going on my first podcast about it very soon. So just, I guess I see that this method helped heal. I mean, and grief never fully heals, but has helped me integrate and live happily despite the loss of my dad and make meaning of it. And it's worked. So I'm kind of trying the same methods about the schools, you know, make it where my childhood wasn't taken, but, you know, something was given. So who knows, maybe in like 3 years, that'll all turn out really successful and I'll be happy about it. And we'll have a different answer about the schools. With my dad, it's very interesting because I miss him every day. There's an ache. You change in some way profoundly after a loss. But some of it's really for the better. Like, I have better friends than I've ever had. If I could choose between having my dad here for another 10 years, but what I thought before, that when you die, that's it, or would I choose to have lost him? And I would choose to have lost him because, like, eternity, let's say he lived to like 100. Let's say he lived to be the oldest man on the planet. Whatever human span doesn't even come close to the concept of either, you know, what seems to be the evidence, which is either eternity or at least significantly longer, maybe until the death of this universe. But I still think we would go past that in some way, past the death of the universe, into some form of eternity. And whether that's like, you know, through the next Big Bang, there's evolutions again and you get to be somebody else, but there's no continuation, but at least you still get to be conscious. I don't know. I haven't analyzed enough yet what could happen after the big crunch and then the next Big Bang. But I do think there's eternal life of forms. Like, I don't think this is the one planet and the one time there's been complex physical consciousness here. So, and I mean, that's just so much better than even getting your whole family to live till really elderly and till you're a lot older. So in one sense, I'm happier than I've ever been.
Yeah. How do you convince someone to be open to all this life after death?
Yeah, I mean, depending who, I think one of the first things that was pivotal for me that I heard a little later. Well, first I always do mention that there are scientists studying this, including ones who've worked with Dr. Stephen Hawking. I think approach it in a logical way where you don't jump to major conclusions and don't use for me, would have been very flowery words. Those always were very terrifying and off-putting to me early on because I'd be like, oh, I mean, this was emotional. I wasn't just, you know, being arrogant, like, oh, I know better. There couldn't be life after death. I was devastated and terrified. I think remembering that this is not an unemotional topic, even if someone hasn't experienced a loss, we all will. So having patience with that. While I speak about it in a logical way, as I said, mentioning the researchers who'd worked with Dr. Stephen Hawking, saying that no one's drawn a definite conclusion, because I think it's harder to believe if someone's like, oh, we're 100% convinced, but saying that there's a preponderance of evidence. And then bringing up the hard problem of consciousness, that we don't understand consciousness, and explaining that what I think a lot of us who think life after death is impossible, we just sort of think that it's really logical that consciousness is created by a brain, but when you start thinking deeply about that, that's just as weird and illogical, that this material mass and matter fires just the right way, at just this right tipping point, I mean, that's just as weird. So,
Yeah, they don't question the whole universe and the planets and all the elements and everything that works together to create this. It's just like, oh yeah, that's here, but yeah, I don't know about my brain and my consciousness. It's, we're,
yeah.
we're such
Yeah.
simple being. We're such simple beings that think we know so much, but
Right.
there's only so much you can do with this.
Or some
Anyways.
might question it, but a lot don't know about all that evidence out there, that there's all this logical research being done on survival of consciousness. I had no idea. Like, if I had known this all along, I think a lot of my existential dread in my life would have been eased, even way before losing my dad. I think it just would have been, aspects of life would have felt lighter in a certain way.
Right. Now, the whole concept of past lives, soul contracts, choosing your life before birth, including the hardships, having come across this idea, does it conflict or comfort you based on what you've discovered?
Well, I feel those are different parts, different aspects. I'll start with past lives. That was actually the very first thing that gave me hope of survival. You know, the thing about time and quantum physics was the first thing that gave me thoughts maybe there's something more worth looking into. But the very first thing that I was like, oh my God, there seems to be something, was first my own thoughts on past lives and then the research on it. And in my own thoughts, and I still go to this now as this would be the worst possibility in a good way. I mean, nothing's as bad as what I originally thought, which was the permanent obliteration of consciousness. So I'm like, in the worst case scenario, it would be this, which is, let's say consciousness is created by brain neurons. And again, this was my very first thought that gave me hope. Okay, so our consciousness is created by brain neurons. You take the concept of eternity, infinity, infinite time, and as I was saying, there is not just one miraculous big bang and one miraculous big crunch and one miraculous evolution of humans or other beings that are as complex. This happens, I believe, through eternity. Eternal big bangs, eternal big crunches. And the odds of eternity, eternal evolutions, there is no way another set of brain neurons will not come together at some point, even if it's in 10 trillion years, which will feel like nothing, from one life to the next, and will not create another you. Not another Joe, not another Liz exactly, although why not? If you think of eternity, that you'll at least, another set of neurons will create an experience that gets to be you as another person. You'll experience it just like in the theory of reincarnation, you experience many lives. Now, with that theory, there's no soul contracts, there's no continuation of memories, but it's certainly, that is significantly better than eternal obliteration. And even if you don't experience it for another 5 big bangs, which could be beyond trillions of years, that is nothing when you think of the concept of eternity. Now, that was the first thought I had, that I was like, maybe we live multiple lives. That makes more sense than we don't. And I was like, and if that's the case, is there any possibility that some memories have continued? And I Googled that, and that's where everything changed. And I found the research of doctors Ian Stevenson, who he passed away in, I believe, the early 2000s, and his protege who took over, Dr. Jim Tucker. They are part of the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies. They're child psychiatrists and professors of psychiatry at the University of Virginia. They study cases of kids with past life memories, and they match them up. They use very strict protocols, kids with the memories can't be over 5 years old because you won't know where they got that information. You can't prove they didn't hear it somewhere and unconsciously make up a story around it. But, some of the consistencies anyway are the kids seem to forget the memories starting around 5. But they study these kids, they match them up with past lives. And I mean, that's a very shortened way of saying this. If you start delving into the cases, it is one of the biggest what the fucks in the world. And I mean, I can go into details of the cases, but you know, if you want, but they're out there, they're amazing. And then regarding the soul contracts and all that I think it's possible. I hear it. It doesn't have the strength of evidence that, you know, the cases of kids with past life memories. That's going to another level where it's a little possible. I think that part's possible, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's the past lives with children? What are maybe one or two examples of veritable information that you found so compelling?
Sure. Well, the most known one and the first one, or the strongest one, which is why it's the most known, is the James Leininger case. Do your listeners know that one? Should I go for a less known one, or are these?
I've covered Dr. Jim Tucker and even Stevenson very lightly, just to give people the awareness of this. I've never really talked about the actual cases.
Okay, well then I'll talk about James Leininger. So James Leininger was a little boy. He was from a Christian family in middle of America, and I mention that because, you know, it's Christian faith where they don't believe at all in reincarnation. So he would have, and he'd never heard of the idea. And since he was about a baby, he would wake up screaming with nightmares. And, you know, when he was old enough to speak, like 1, 2, he'd just start saying things like, plane on fire, little man go down, plane on fire, little man go down. And he kept drawing pictures of like planes on fire. He kept playing out little plane crashes. I mean, his parents were horrified. They had no idea what to do. And one time they even took him to a World War II fighter jet museum, and he knew stuff about one of the planes that there was no way a child, or really most people knew. I mean, something was wrong. The museum had called something like the wrong name, or I don't remember the exact things, but it was something that only like the most educated expert would know. I mean, even the museum curator got it wrong, and they must have been an expert enough to be the curator of the planes. And he was like, no, that's actually wrong. And he knew things there at the museum. He was like, oh, he knew the name of the planes. I mean, he was like 3. And no one in his family was a pilot. And these were also like fighter jets. And another part of it, he had these little dolls, and I forget the exact hair color, but let's say one had blonde hair, one had black hair, and one had red hair. And they were little, like, I guess, army dolls, and he gave them each a name. And, I mean, there was other things, too. Like, he talked about, he just knew so many things. Mm-hmm. And his family begins to wonder, could this be a past life? They contact Dr. Jim Tucker, who takes the case. He thinks there's enough information. He, sees the way the boy plays and the way the nightmares are, and he says this isn't normal playing. The boy is playing exactly the way a child does when they experience a severe trauma. Like, let's say a child witnessed a murder. They'll replay it that way, exactly the way this little boy was. And so it seemed to be he was mimicking behaviors of children experiencing a real trauma. Wow. And just further and further research, they trace him to a man, also called James. I believe the man who, I don't remember which one was James Leininger, if it was the little boy or the past personality, but, you know, it's called the James Leininger case. I think that was the little boy's name, not the deceased James, but matches up to a man who was a World War II fighter pilot who died. The way he died had been ways James was playing out. He ends up meeting like old Air Force buddies, and turned out people, I believe they had died. I'm not sure. Obviously not the ones he met, or I guess not obviously given the material, but there were 3 men who'd been part of the troop. One had brown hair, black hair, red hair, whatever, and they matched up with the names of the dolls. And he met his sister. I mean, they were now like elderly men, and his sister an elderly woman, and they shared memories. And it was that was one of the strongest cases, but there are a couple others, such as an actor, the Marty Martinson case. I mean, so there's a few. Mm-hmm. And then there's just nonstop, like once you start delving in. There are people whose cases are nowhere near strong enough to be studied by Dr. Tucker, but they still have the consistency. Children will talk about memories until they're 5 years old. They'll say, when I was big. Just lots of these little things, and the consistency of it is amazing. As well as, like, there's like a sort of a normal mundaneness to the memories in a really good way. Like, the cliche is people talk about their past life memories and they're like, I was Cleopatra, I was queen of, but that's not what these are. These kids aren't sharing fantastic memories. They're like, will suddenly share this little memory of like remembering having hot chocolate after school at grandma's, like the stuff that really matters, and the stuff that's just part of our real lives.
That's so interesting. I love that line of work.
Fascinating.
Anyone interested, look into it. It's there. I want to wrap up with a few fun questions for you, Liz.
Sure. Let's do it.
Now, they say once you pass over, at least people that have had near-death experiences say, like, everything. It's like everything downloads. But let's suppose, like, you couldn't retain any knowledge except for one thing to take into the afterlife. What would that be?
Ooh, I mean, I'd want to remember the people I loved the most. And I find it impossible to pick one of them, So the people, I'd let them pick who. That'd be too hard to choose.
You can have all of them, of course.
Okay, I'll take my people.
And
animals, my loved ones. Let's just say my loved ones.
Yes. Mm-hmm. If you could ask a spirit or a disincarnate consciousness something, or maybe have a supernatural power for a day, what would you ask and what would you choose as your superpower?
So what I would ask them is, how does this all work? Like, where is this consciousness stored? What is the mechanism of non-physical consciousness, and how does it entangle with the brain? And if I could have and does it go eternally, or is it fizzle out after a certain amount of time? Just how it works. If I could have a superpower, it would probably be just to travel anywhere, which means like through black holes, through, other planets, other dimensions, just a full day where I could just go travel everywhere. Or a near-death experience maybe, but not like not one where like my body was damaged anyway. Just go through that whole near-death experience, like the farthest you can go.
Yeah, wouldn't that be something?
Yeah,
I've listened to hundreds and hundreds of them, and it's just
amazing.
So lastly,
Yes.
what's the most bizarre, or I know we've covered a lot, but what's the most bizarre or unexplainable thing you encountered that made you think this might be real?
Oh my God. I mean, it was my first medium reading. Constantly the evidence. It really isn't one thing. It's like every one thing you can explain away, or just be like, that was so weird, but in a world of 8 billion people, there's going to be one really weird thing, like the feathers, But when it all comes together, there's just too much weird stuff. And too much weird stuff happens to too many people, whether it's people I've met or I read about. And there's so much consistency to all of it. And the further you go with this, the more and more happens. Like the feathers combined with the weird thoughts I was having before them and the feelings, the amount of medium readings I've had, the fact that some weren't good, and that validates that I'm able to assess accurately, the fact that I've gotten to know these mediums as people and I know they're not delusional or fraudulent, the amount of other people who've come to the same conclusions, the fact that when almost everyone delves into this, there's so many, we all kind of come to the same conclusions for the same reasons from the same people. And it's just, there's way, way, way too much inexplicable. And that when it all comes together, it gives the same answer.
Awesome. Well, Liz, tell everyone what's coming up for you, where they can find you. I'll link your channel, I'll link your books, everything in the description for everyone to go grab a copy. I read both, they're amazing. Check out What the Fuck Just Happened podcast. And Liz, tell us about what you got going on.
Sure. So you can check both my books. and my podcast. You can find all of that at WTFJustHappened.net. My podcast, WTF Just Happened, all about the afterlife, no woo, is on every podcast app you can find. The videos on YouTube. Again, the books you can also find everywhere. There are books like, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, more indie places. Again, you can link to all of that through my website. On social media, I'm pretty active on Instagram and TikTok, linking to both those on my website, or just, I'm forgetting TikTok off the top of my head. Instagram's WTF_just_happened_. And I also host science and spirituality salons, and I just launched science and spirituality circles, all on my website. And the next project is I'm finishing recording my audiobook for What the Fuck Book 2. So right now you can only get 2 in ebook or paperback, and audio will be just not much longer. And the first one you can get every form. So, and reach out. I love meeting people, talking to them. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Liz. Everyone, keep questioning, keep seeking, and I'll see you in the next one.